what is really behind the so-called Royal Integrity 2026 dossier, and why has Prince William reportedly become so determined to take control of the West Wing budget, according to multiple sources close to the royal household. Everything began with a deep internal shift in power that slowly built up over time and eventually turned into what insiders are calling a full financial reckoning led by the Prince of Wales. By April 2026, reports suggest that the traditional way the royal budget was managed, something that had largely been under the oversight of Queen Camilla in previous years, was suddenly and firmly taken out of her control and brought under William's direct supervision. Leaked information indicates that this was not treated inside the palace as a normal administrative adjustment or routine reshuffle, but instead as a deliberate and strategic intervention designed to protect the long-term financial stability of the crown after what investigators describe as suspected systemic irregularities in the accounts. In other words, the shift is being framed by insiders not as simple housekeeping, but as a serious correction aimed at preventing deeper damage to the monarchy's finances. At the same time, the situation around Queen Camilla and her children, Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopes, is described by palace staff as increasingly isolated and politically sensitive. For years, the Parker BS family is said to have operated close to royal life while maintaining a quiet public profile, but the leaked Royal Integrity 2026 dossier suggests they may have been more financially connected to royal structures than the public ever understood. Within the West Wing, the atmosphere during key March meetings is described as tense and almost suffocating, as William allegedly presented extensive financial documentation pointing toward irregular payment patterns and unexplained financial flows. These reports claim the evidence pointed to a structured system of payments that appeared to support lifestyles and expenses tied to individuals who hold no official working royal status and do not perform public duties. This early phase of the situation, according to the leaks, set the tone for everything that followed, marking the beginning of a much larger internal confrontation over how royal money had been managed, who had access to it, and whether long-standing informal arrangements had blurred the line between official state spending and private benefit. The leaked reports go on to suggest that what happened next inside the palace was far more serious than a simple change in responsibility. According to insiders, the transfer of budget control was seen as a calculated move by Prince William after what was described as growing concern over irregular patterns in royal financial records. Sources close to the situation claim that this was not a decision made lightly or quickly, but rather the result of months of quiet internal review and escalating tension behind the scenes. The documents being referenced in the Royal Integrity 2026 dossier reportedly pointed toward multiple accounting inconsistencies that raised questions about how certain funds were being categorized and distributed within the royal system. From William's perspective, as described by those familiar with the discussions, the issue was not just about numbers on a page, but about protecting the long-term credibility and financial discipline of the monarchy itself. At the same time, the impact of these changes on Queen Camilla and her immediate family is described as both sudden and deeply isolating. Palace staff are quoted as saying that the atmosphere around her shifted noticeably as access, influence, and informal channels of communication began to narrow. The Parker BS family, including Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopes, are portrayed in the leaks as finding themselves increasingly distanced from the central operations of royal life, despite what the documents suggest may have been years of closer financial proximity than was publicly acknowledged. According to the same sources, what makes this situation more sensitive is the suggestion that their connection to royal funding structures may have been more integrated than previously believed, even if it was not officially recognized in public roles or titles. During the critical March meetings referenced in the dossier, multiple insiders described the environment in the West Wing as extremely tense, with a level of seriousness that staff had rarely experienced before. William is said to have presented a large body of compiled material that allegedly traced unusual financial activity across different categories of spending, drawing attention to patterns that appeared inconsistent with standard royal accounting practices. These presentations, according to the leaks, focused heavily on identifying how certain payments had been structured and routed in ways that made them appear legitimate on the surface while raising questions under deeper review. The key concern highlighted in these reports was the possibility of a wider system of financial arrangements that extended beyond official royal duties and into personal benefit areas involving individuals without formal working responsibilities. As these findings were laid out, the atmosphere reportedly became increasingly strained, as those present began to understand that the issue was not limited to isolated transactions, but potentially part of a broader and more complex financial network that required urgent scrutiny. The next stage of the Royal Integrity 2026 leaks shifts focus from internal tension to the growing seriousness of the allegations being reviewed by William's team. According to palace sources, the investigation moved beyond general concerns and began concentrating on specific financial patterns that appeared repeatedly across different years and categories of spending. Insiders describe this phase as the point where the situation stopped being treated as a routine audit and instead started resembling a structured inquiry into how royal funds may have been redirected or reclassified over time. The leaked documents allegedly show that several streams of expenditure were repeatedly labeled under standard royal operational headings. But when cross-checked with supporting records, they raised questions about whether the actual beneficiaries matched the stated purpose. This is where the dossier begins to build its core argument that there may have been a parallel system of financial flow operating alongside official accounts, one that was not clearly visible in standard reporting structures. Within the palace, this development reportedly intensified concern, especially among senior staff who were directly involved in financial oversight. The situation is described as becoming increasingly sensitive, as more detailed analysis revealed inconsistencies that could not easily be explained as administrative error or routine accounting adjustments. Instead, the patterns allegedly pointed toward a repeated structure of allocation that required deeper justification. At the same time, the personal impact of these findings reportedly began to widen as attention turned toward individuals connected to Queen Camilla's private circle. According to leaked accounts, Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopes were increasingly mentioned in internal discussions, not as official royal figures, but as part of financial pathways being examined for irregular overlap between private benefit and public funding channels. Palace staff described this period as one where communication inside the West Wing became more controlled and formal, with fewer informal discussions and a stronger emphasis on documented exchanges. William's position, as presented in the leaks, is said to have remained firm and methodical, focusing on ensuring that every claim was supported by verifiable records rather than assumptions or tradition. Those familiar with the process describe his approach as deliberately cautious but uncompromising, with an emphasis on tracing every disputed transaction back to its origin and intended purpose. As this phase progressed, the tone inside the palace reportedly shifted further from uncertainty to confrontation, as it became increasingly clear that the investigation was no longer about isolated discrepancies, but about whether the structure of financial oversight itself needed fundamental correction. As the Royal Integrity 2026 investigation deepened, the leaked reports suggest that the focus began shifting from general accounting concerns to highly specific financial categories that had previously attracted little scrutiny. According to insiders, William's team started conducting a line-by-line review of expense records stretching back several years, comparing official royal diary entries with corresponding financial claims and reimbursements, This stage of the inquiry is described as particularly methodical, with auditors allegedly looking for mismatches between declared royal duties and the timing of certain high-value expenditures. The dossier reportedly highlights repeated instances where spending categories appeared legitimate in isolation but became questionable when cross-referenced with real-world schedules and documented engagements. Palace sources described this as the moment when the investigation gained real momentum, because patterns began to emerge that could no longer be easily dismissed as coincidence or administrative oversight. At the same time, attention within the palace reportedly intensified around how certain funds were categorized under broader budget headings, especially those related to hospitality, travel, and personal services. According to the leaks, these categories contained multiple entries that required further explanation, particularly when linked to private events and non-official gatherings. Within internal discussions, William is said to have emphasized the importance of separating institutional obligations from private benefit, arguing that any overlap between the two would undermine public trust in the monarchy's financial integrity. This principle reportedly became a guiding standard for the entire review process. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's position within the evolving structure is described as increasingly constrained, with her financial discretion becoming more limited as oversight mechanisms tightened around her office. Palace staff reportedly observed a noticeable change in workflow, with greater documentation requirements and stricter approval chains for all expenditures. The Parker BS family, meanwhile, continued to be referenced in the leaked material as part of the broader examination of financial flows, not as direct royal officials but as individuals whose connections to certain spending patterns were being carefully reviewed. According to the dossier, this phase marked a turning point where the investigation moved from identifying irregularities to building a structured case around how and why those irregularities may have occurred, setting the stage for more direct confrontations within the royal household. In the next phase of the Royal Integrity 2026 dossier, the investigation reportedly became even more focused and data-driven, moving into what insiders describe as a forensic breakdown of individual transactions. According to leaked accounts, William's audit team began isolating specific expense lines and tracing them back through multiple layers of approval records, supplier invoices, and internal correspondence. This process allegedly revealed a pattern where certain costs were consistently routed through overlapping budget categories, making it difficult to immediately distinguish between official royal duties and privately associated expenditures. Palace sources say this level of scrutiny was unprecedented in recent memory, with the review expanding beyond summary totals into detailed verification of each entry's purpose and justification. As this work progressed, attention reportedly narrowed further onto high-value spending areas such as luxury services, private travel arrangements, and estate-related enhancements, where inconsistencies appeared more frequently when compared against official schedules. The leaked dossier suggests that William's approach was not only focused on identifying irregularities, but also on reconstructing the timeline of how decisions were made, including who authorized specific allocations and under what assumptions they were approved. Within the palace environment, this created a growing sense of pressure, as staff involved in financial administration were required to provide additional documentation and clarification for historical entries that had previously gone unquestioned. At the same time, the report indicates that Queen Camilla's office experienced increasing operational restrictions, with tighter controls placed on discretionary spending and a requirement for dual-level approvals on most financial decisions. According to insiders, this change significantly altered the internal dynamics of the West Wing, shifting it from a relatively flexible administrative structure into a tightly monitored system governed by compliance checks. The Parker BS family continues to appear in the leaked material as part of a wider examination of associated financial pathways, particularly in relation to how certain costs may have been indirectly attributed across different accounts. Palace observers describe this stage of the investigation as the point where the focus fully transitioned from suspicion to structured verification, with William's team reportedly working to establish a complete evidence-based map of financial activity before any formal conclusions or actions were taken. At this stage of the Royal Integrity 2020-26 dossier, the investigation reportedly expanded into a full cross-departmental review, bringing together financial auditors, legal advisors, and palace compliance officers under Prince William's direct oversight. According to leaked sources, this phase marked a clear shift from identifying irregular patterns to actively reconstructing how the entire budgeting system functioned over time. William's team is said to have begun comparing long-term expenditure trends against official royal engagement records, aiming to determine whether spending levels matched the stated public duties of the household. The findings allegedly pointed to repeated mismatches in several categories, where financial activity appeared significantly higher than what would normally be expected based on documented royal schedules. Palace insiders described this as a critical moment because it suggested that the issue was not limited to isolated entries, but potentially reflected a broader structural problem in how expenses were recorded and justified. As the review deepened, attention reportedly turned toward procurement processes and vendor relationships, with auditors examining how certain service providers were selected and how contracts were structured over time. The leaked material claims that some suppliers appeared repeatedly across different budget lines, raising questions about whether the same services were being billed under multiple classifications. Within the West Wing, this created an atmosphere of heightened caution, as staff were required to produce additional documentation and historical records to support previously approved expenditures. Queen Camilla's office, according to the leaks, became subject to stricter procedural oversight, with new requirements introduced for logging, verification, and secondary approval before any funds could be released or reallocated. Meanwhile, references to Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopes in the dossier are described as part of a wider mapping exercise rather than direct allegations, focusing on how certain financial pathways may have indirectly intersected with private interest over time. Palace sources say William's approach during this phase remained highly controlled and analytical, with an emphasis on building a comprehensive audit trail that could withstand internal review and external scrutiny. The overall tone of the investigation, as described in the leaks, shifted further toward institutional accountability, with the central aim becoming the establishment of a clear and defensible financial record of how royal funds were managed across the period under review. In the next stage of the Royal Integrity 2026 leaks, the investigation is described as moving into its most technically detailed phase, yet focusing on deep verification of financial systems rather than surface-level discrepancies. According to Palace sources, Prince William's audit team began reconstructing entire financial workflows, tracking how a single expense would move from initial request to final approval and payment. This allowed investigators to identify where categorization changes may have occurred during the process, and whether those changes aligned with standard royal accounting protocols. The leaked reports suggest that this stage revealed repeated inconsistencies in how similar types of expenses were recorded across different departments, with certain costs appearing under varying classifications, depending on the context in which they were filed. Palace insiders described this as a key breakthrough moment, because it indicated that the issue might not simply be about isolated misjudgments, but about systemic inconsistencies in financial handling practices. As a result, The investigation reportedly expanded to include historical policy review, examining how budget rules had evolved over time and whether those changes had unintentionally created gaps in oversight. Within the West Wing, this led to a significant increase in documentation requests, as staff were asked to retrieve archived approvals, correspondence, and financial justifications going back several years. Queen Camilla's administrative office, according to leaked accounts, came under tighter procedural control, with stricter compliance checks introduced for even minor expenditures. Every request reportedly required multiple layers of validation, reflecting the heightened sensitivity of the ongoing review. At the same time, references to the Parker BS family in the dossier are described as part of a broader contextual mapping of financial interactions, where investigators were attempting to understand how certain spending patterns may have intersected with private associations over time. Palace observers say William's leadership during this phase remained focused on building a fully traceable financial narrative, ensuring that every figure in the accounts could be supported by a clear, documented chain of authorization. The atmosphere inside the palace is described as increasingly formal and controlled, as the investigation transitioned from identifying irregularities to establishing a complete institutional record intended to restore long-term financial transparency and accountability. At this stage of the Royal Integrity 2026 dossier, the investigation reportedly shifts from internal auditing into what palace sources describe as full structural validation of the monarchy's financial framework. According to leaked information, Prince William's team began stress testing the entire budgeting system to see how it would behave under strict compliance standards, effectively simulating how every category of spending would stand up to modern accountability requirements. This phase allegedly involved reclassifying historical expenditures into standardized audit models to identify where legacy practices may have allowed ambiguity in financial reporting. The leaked reports suggest that this exercise revealed deeper inconsistencies in how certain long-term expense categories had been maintained, particularly where historical precedent had been used to justify flexible interpretations of budget rules. Palace insiders described this as a turning point where the investigation stopped being purely reactive and became proactive system reform. Within the West Wing, staff were reportedly instructed to adopt new documentation protocols that required real-time tracking of approvals and expenditures, significantly reducing reliance on retrospective justification. Queen Camilla's office, according to the leaks, experienced a further tightening of operational authority, with all discretionary financial decisions now requiring external validation from newly appointed oversight officials aligned with William and Princess Anne's reform structure. At the same time, references to Tom Parker BS and Laura Lopes continue to appear in the dossier, though insiders emphasize that the investigation is framed around financial mapping rather than personal targeting, focusing on whether historical allocation patterns intersected with private benefit pathways in any systemic way. Palace sources describe William's approach during this phase as increasingly institutional in nature, shifting away from individual transactions and toward long-term governance reform. The goal, as described in the leaked material, is no longer just to identify what went wrong, but to redesign the financial architecture of the royal household so that similar issues cannot occur again. The atmosphere inside the palace is reported to have stabilized into a controlled but highly monitored environment, where transparency and procedural compliance have become the dominant operational principles guiding every financial decision. In the next phase of the Royal Integrity 2026 dossier, the investigation reportedly enters what insiders describe as the enforcement preparation stage, where findings from the audit are translated into potential corrective actions. According to leaked palace sources, Prince William's team began consolidating all verified discrepancies into a single, structured framework designed to determine financial liability, repayment scope, and institutional safeguards. This phase allegedly involved separating confirmed irregularities from unresolved anomalies, ensuring that only fully evidenced items were carried forward into enforcement planning. The leaked reports suggest that auditors worked through a detailed reconciliation process, matching expenditure records against engagement logs, contract files, and approval chains to finalize a clear picture of financial flow. Palace insiders describe this as one of the most sensitive stages because it shifted the investigation from analysis into consequences, requiring legal and constitutional review at the highest level. Within the West Wing, the atmosphere is said to have become more controlled and procedural, with communication increasingly routed through formal channels rather than informal discussion. Staff were reportedly instructed to maintain strict documentation discipline, as every record could now potentially form part of an official enforcement decision. Queen Camilla's office, according to the leaks, operated under heightened oversight conditions, with all financial activity subject to real-time review and secondary authorization. At the same time, references to the Parker B.S. family in the dossier are described as being incorporated into broader liability mapping, where investigators examined whether certain financial benefits could be traced through indirect or secondary allocation routes. Palace observers say that William's focus during this phase remained firmly on institutional stability, with an emphasis on ensuring that any corrective measures were legally sound, proportionate, and fully documented. The investigation, as described in the leaked material, had now fully transitioned into its most consequential stage, where audit findings were no longer just internal observations, but the basis for potential structural and financial reform across the royal household. In the final phase of the Royal Integrity 2026 dossier, the leaked reports describe the investigation as moving into full institutional resolution, where findings are converted into permanent structural reforms within the royal household. According to Palace sources, Prince William's team finalized a comprehensive settlement framework that defined how confirmed financial discrepancies would be addressed through restitution mechanisms, governance changes, and long-term oversight controls. This stage allegedly focused on closing all remaining audit gaps by ensuring every identified transaction had a documented explanation, correction path, or formal classification outcome. The leaked material suggests that auditors completed a final reconciliation process, consolidating all verified data into a single authoritative financial record intended to serve as the baseline for future royal budgeting standards. Palace insiders describe this moment as the point where the investigation transitioned from active review to institutional reset, with the emphasis shifting toward preventing any recurrence of similar financial issues through structural redesign. Within the West Wing, operations reportedly became fully standardized, with new compliance systems embedded into daily financial procedures and automated tracking introduced for all significant expenditures. Queen Camilla's office, according to the leaks, functioned under a permanently revised oversight model where discretionary spending required continuous validation under the new governance framework. At the same time, references to the Parker B.S. family are described in the dossier as part of the final accounting summary, where all associated financial pathways were either closed, reclassified, or formally resolved within the broader audit outcome. Palace observers say William's final position throughout this phase remained focused on institutional integrity, emphasizing that the monarchy's financial credibility depended on absolute transparency and enforceable accountability. The conclusion of the investigation, as outlined in the leaked documents, marks a definitive shift in how royal finances are managed, with a permanently embedded oversight structure designed to ensure that all future expenditures remain fully traceable, justified than ever. and aligned with public duty standards.